John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we're reading Hellblazer number 148. But before we get into that, just a little catch-up on what's been going on. In this arc, John is in prison, and he's been having to deal with a lot of gangs trying to hurt him and stuff, but he hasn't really had an issue. He's just been using magic and showing people that he is not someone to mess with. And in the last issue, we saw a bunch of the gang leaders very angry at John going to talk to a lifer who kind of runs the prison, and this guy's name is Stark. And so they're saying that he needs to be dealt with. And at the end of all that storytelling about why he needs to be dealt with, John came out of the shadows, and it turned out that Stark and John are now working together. So that's where we left off with the last issue. So first things first, with issue 148, we got the cover. We see the bars motif just like all the other issues of this prison arc. And there are 3 horizontal panels like usual. The top one has Stark and his boys, and they're looking kind of tough as they look out at us. Then the second panel is a bloody bar of soap on the shower floor as water swirls around it and down a drain. And then the third panel has John holding a knife or a shiv of some kind that is bloody, and he's looking out at us as he smokes a cigarette. And on the cover, it says that this issue was written by Brian Azzarello with art by Richard Corbin. And as we turn to the first page, we see the name of this issue is Hard Time Part 3. And we start off on this page with a guard doing a surprise inspection of one of the inmates' cells. We see the inmate is outside on the balcony, but he has been made to hold onto the bars and spread his arms wide and his legs wide, kind of like he's about to get searched. And he's looking over his shoulder to see if they're finding anything. And we see the prison guard has a big smile on his face as he's doing this, so you can tell he's having a good time. And we can also see down the balcony a bit, there is Stark and his right-hand man with glasses that was in the room from the last issue, and then 2 more lifers we can assume are with him as well. Then we see in one of the panels on this page that one of the guards does find something in the cell, and he holds it up, and it's a big jar of alcohol. Then the head guard grabs the bottle, and he turns around and he holds it up to Stark, and Stark looks very angry that it was found. And over these panels, we get some narration. Now, I could not figure out who was doing this narration. Like, there's no obvious points in the comic where someone's talking out of the narration, but just because he's so prevalent in this comic, I think it is supposed to be Stark. So I'm going to do the narration bits in his voice. So over all these panels, he narrates, "You want to know what I used to think was worse than dying? Spending my life in prison. When they threw me in this fuckhole, I was back to square motherfucking number 1. I was so pissed off I couldn't stop crying for days. Not weeping like no bitch, though. It was way deep. My life had no value to anybody. And that is a fucked up thing." Then we turn the page and we cut back to Stark's little office where he's talking to his right-hand man with glasses, and he's saying, "God damn that son of a bitch. I'm gonna kill him." And of course, he's talking about the guard who found the jar of alcohol and then teased him with it. And his right-hand man replies, "Take it easy, boss. You can't be going off half-cocked on some screw." We also see in the corner of this office at the desk, John is sitting there smoking, and he is doing a puzzle now, which was what Stark was doing in the last issue. And to Stark's right-hand man saying that he can't go off half-cocked, Stark very angrily snaps back, "Don't you fucking tell me what I can do. I got eyes, Buzz. It's fucking crystal clear what's going on. That's the 3rd still that pig fucker Kelly has found this month, goddammit. Somebody's tipping him off. One of fucking us." And then John chimes in asking, "How you know that?" And Stark turns to him and asks, "What?" And then John goes back to putting the puzzle together and he says, "I mean, why you suspect it's one of our own lads?" And then Stark looks at him and says, "Why? I'll tell you why, London. 'Cause other than my lads, every fuck in this place is a pussy. They're all afraid of me." And he pulls out a cigarette and he lights it, and as he puffs on it, he says, "All of them, except you." And then John and him look at each other for a minute, and then John gets a little smile on his face and he says, "That's not true. Only a fool wouldn't be afraid of you." And then he goes back to putting his puzzle together. And then there's another pause where Stark is just looking at him, almost like he can't tell if John is joking with him or not. And then he says to John, like hell, don't shit a shitter. But John, who doesn't really seem to be paying attention too much of this conversation, finishes the puzzle and he yells, done. But Stark doesn't really seem amused by that. In fact, it seems like he wants John to take this way more seriously. So he leans forward and he puts his hand on the puzzle, which we can see is of a naked lady. And he leans close to John and he says, you know something? You're pretty good with the puzzles. And then he sweeps his hand across the desk and throws the puzzle on the ground. And then he gets in John's face and he says, so figure this one out, okay? Meaning he's telling John to figure out who is tipping off the guard. Then we turn the page and we cut to later on, either that day or the week. And we see that officer is back at it. He's tossing his cell. We can assume it is another still. But this time as the lifers watch, we see John walking forward and approaching the guard. And as he walks up to the guard, he puts a cigarette in his mouth and says, hey then, Sonny Jim. Mr. Stark there wants to know why you're being such a bug in his arse. And the guard turns around and he stares at John. And he doesn't say anything at first. He just takes the cigarette out of John's mouth and he says, tell him I got a thing for assholes. Then he gets a big smile on his face and he says to John, bet yours is a nice place to visit too. And from that, John doesn't say anything else. He just turns around and he walks back to Stark and he says to him, he's a bit crude, but I think he's trying to say he fancies you. And then he walks past Stark and out of the room. And as Stark and his right-hand man Buzz watch John walk out, Stark says, fucking A. You gotta admire that guy's balls. And Buzz replies, I know. That's a problem. And then Stark turns to go back into his office and he asks Buzz, you got beef? And Buzz answers, no, not me, but someone does. And Stark turns back and asks, oh yeah? What are you telling me, Buzz? And Buzz answers, I'm not telling you shit, Ray, but it's pretty obvious to the boys that England ain't like us. He's no lifer. And Stark asks, somebody say this to you? And Buzz answers, nobody's talking. They don't have to. But somebody's making a play on your turf, right? Could be he feels you showed a weakness towards England. Then we turn the page and we cut to nighttime and we see John is sleeping in his bunk and it's all dark. And then we see someone approach John's bunk and toss him out of bed, and it is the head guard that John talked to earlier. And as he does this, he yells, up and at him, fucko. And as John falls to the ground and catches himself, he yells, Struth. And then he asks, Christ, what time is it then? And the guard answers, what time? It's cell check time. And as another guard tosses John's cell, we see the head officer standing there looking at John with his nightstick in his hand. And John stands up and he gets a pack of cigarettes and he says, bit of news, Kelly. You're not messing with just Stark now. And Kelly says, oh yeah? And then he hits John as hard as he can with the baton in John's stomach. And as John bends down because he got the wind knocked out of him, Officer Kelly wraps his baton around John's neck and he kind of pulls him up and drags him over to the railing outside. And as he does this, he says, you see what happens when you get mouthy with me? You fucking runty-ass little turd. And then he gets real close to John's face and he says, since you're so chummy with Stark there, you tell him from me. This is my house. Then the other guard comes out and he says, there's nothing here, sir. But instead of getting mad, Kelly gets a big smile on his face and he says, oh no? Looks like we need a cavity search then, don't it? Then he pulls out a rubber glove and he says to John, spread 'em, cutie pie. Then John is forced to lean over the bars and spread his cheeks. And as the guard does a cavity search on John, John is just staring forward and taking it, but he's also looking at the cell across from his, which just happens to be the cell of Buzz, the right-hand man of Stark, and Buzz has a big smile on his face. Then we turn the page and we cut to the next day, where John and a bunch of other prisoners are in the laundry room and they're doing the laundry, and John just happens to see in the dirty bucket is a pair of bloody and soiled underwear, and John pulls it out and says, fuck, looks like you had quite a night. And then he tosses the dirty underwear into the dirty bin, and then as he pushes that bin into the washroom, he says to the guard, ready for the wash. And the guard says, go ahead. So John goes in and he pushes the bin to one of the washing machines, and the machines are double stacked, so John goes to a top one, and he opens the door, and as he does, he just happens to notice that through the little window in the back of the laundry is Kelly, the officer that assaulted him last night, and he's talking to someone, So John takes interest and continues watching through the glass, and he sees that the man that Kelly is talking to is actually Buzz, the right-hand man of Stark. And Buzz has a big smile on his face, so it seems like they're pretty chummy. So we can kind of assume that John has just found out who is telling Kelly where the stills are. Then we cut to later that day, where everybody is out in the courtyard outside, and we get some narration from Stark saying, "Do you know what it's like to be treated like you're less than shit? You understand what it does to a man? I'll tell you, when your own life is worthless, everyone else's is too." Then we see Stark walk up to John in the yard, and he says, "Hey there, England. How's it going?" And John answers sarcastically, "Just swimmingly, Stark. Thought I'd take a drive out to the country. Have a bite and a few pints. Care to join me?" And Stark gets a kick out of this, and he says, "Ha! That's good. You seen Buzz?" And we see John getting a thoughtful look on his face as he says, "No, I haven't." Like he was kind of deciding whether he was going to rat out Buzz or not. So Stark scratches his head and he says, "Really? It's visiting day and his wife's here. Yours too." And John asks, "Come again?" And then Stark walks past him and says, "Just give the bull on duty your name. It's all set up." And John asks, "What is?" And Stark answers, "Don't worry about it. That's what friends are for, right?" So we turn the page and we cut to the visiting area where we see a bunch of phone booths lined up and the prisoners are all in their chairs talking to whoever's on the other side of the glass. And one of the guards that John talks to points to a specific chair, and so John walks over there, and that booth just happens to be occupied by Buzz. And on the other side of that glass, we see a woman, and she is stripping for Buzz. She has her shirt off, and she's about to take her pants down. We don't hear it, but John must have said something because Buzz turns to him and says, "Huh? Oh, hey, England." And then John looks at the naked woman and says, "What do we have here then?" And Buzz answers, "What's it look like?" And John says, "A nudie show." And as he stares at the woman looks back at him with what I assume is supposed to be a seductive look, but it just kind of looks like she's drugged out. But Buzz tells John, "Uh-huh, so sit down and enjoy." And then he says to the woman, "Put 'em on the glass, baby." So the woman leans forward and presses her breasts against the glass. And then John pulls out a cigarette and says, "Careful there, Buzz. Soil your knickers. You'll have to fetch a clean pair from your mate Kelly down in the laundry room, eh?" So right there, John told Buzz that he knows without saying it fully. And Buzz looks up at him angrily, but doesn't say anything. And John just smiles and says, "Sorry, touch a nerve?" But Buzz just goes back to staring at the naked woman, and he asks, "You tell Stark?" And John answers, "No. What he doesn't know can't hurt him." And as they watch the woman, she actually sits down in the chair, puts her legs on the desk, and spreads them wide, and then leans back and does something with her hands. We can't see exactly what it is. And to this is one of the funniest panels. John turns his head and he kind of leans in closer, like he's very curious about what she's doing. And he's got a big smile on his face as he finishes his thought saying, "But it can hurt you, I'd imagine." And to that now, Buzz doesn't say anything, but he has a very worried look on his face. And I kind of love this scene because they're talking about something very serious, which is John ratting out Buzz to Stark. But every time they're supposed to have like a serious moment, the dancer changes her position, which then makes the two forget what they were saying. And then once they get a good look, they resume the conversation until the next lurid pose. So a second ago, Buzz was worried, but now the woman has jumped up on the desk and now her rear is facing the men and she is bending over seductively and the two men lean forward to get a better view. And Buzz says to John, "You're a pretty smart guy, aren't you?" And John answers, "More or less." And then John leans more forward to get a better view and he says, "Keep that in mind." And Buzz says, "I will." And then the woman who's still on the desk facing away from them is bent forward, and of course the men can see her through her legs, and she's smiling at them, and then she starts playing with her chest, and John asks, "She really your wife?" And Buzz answers, "No, I killed my wife. My kids too. Cut their throats while they slept. Then burnt the house down. It's why I'm in here. You keep that in mind." And to that, John actually gives pause, and he doesn't say anything. He just watches the woman turn back around and lick the glass, and Buzz says, "So that's my story, England. What's yours?" And John answers, "Me? I put the devil out of his misery. Then we turn the page and we cut to the balcony of the second floor of the prison cells. And as usual, John is leaning against the railing and he's smoking. And we see in the distance down the balcony, Stark and Buzz are walking towards him. And it seems like they're discussing something. And the closer they get to John, it looks like Buzz is trying to convince Stark of something. Then we see Buzz turn and walk away, and Stark continues over to John. And over these panels, Stark's narration says, "See, once you figure out nobody's life is worth a squirt of piss, snuffing some fuck means nothing. Nothing at all. Just a means to an end. To shut some loudmouth up. To score a pack of squares. To get a bigger cell. To establish your rep. You get stone hard protecting your rep, because when it all shakes out, your rep's all you got." And as Stark approaches John, he says, "Hey, England, you and me got business." And John looks up and asks, "We do?" And Stark answers, "Damn right we do. Let's go." And he grabs John by the arm, and John looks down at Stark's grip, but he goes along with it. So Stark walks John to the weight room, and as they enter, he asks, "You got many friends, England?" And John answers, "Friends? No, can't say that I do. Not that I have any trouble making them, mind you. It's keeping them that proves a problem." And there's a bunch of other prisoners working out in here, but as they see Stark enter, Stark gives them a signal to leave, and they all clear out. And as Stark gives the signal, he says to John, "That's too bad. Guy like me, you wouldn't think friendship was high on my list, would you? But it is. Friendship's the most goddamn important thing in the world. It's what really gives your life worth. Everything else is bullshit." And John asks, "That's so?" And Stark answers, "Fuck yeah, it is." And then just as one of the last guys is about to leave, Stark grabs that man by the arm and says, "Nah, you stay put, Weathers. I need you here." And then Stark turns back to John and says, "You know something else, England? My friend Buzz is a real smart guy. Was a lawyer back in the real world. Knows how to play all the angles. Figure out the easiest way to get done what needs doing." Then we see the door open and Officer Kelly walks in, and Stark waves him in, and as he does, he says, "He tells me our guy Kelly here, he ain't busting my balls for no reason. He says he must want something." And as John puffs his cigarette, he asks, "And what would that be?" And Stark answers, "Same thing everybody else wants, a piece of my action." Then he turns to Weathers and he asks, "Ain't that right, Weathers?" And immediately upon saying that, Officer Kelly gets out his baton and he hits Weathers in the back, making him fall down. And as he cries out and rolls on the ground, Stark says to John, "Can you believe this shit, England? One of my own boys ratting me out to this fucking screw." And as Kelly bends down to grab Weathers and bring him up, he says, "Hey," like he's offended at what Stark just said. But Stark looks at him and smiles and says, "Keep your shirt on, Kelly. Nothing personal. You and me, we're partners now, right?" And then Kelly holds Weathers up to Stark, and Weathers looks very nervous and scared as Stark looks at him and says, "And you and me, Weathers. I'm cutting you loose, snitch." Then Stark goes over to a weight machine, and it's one of those ones that has plates that are stacked on top of one another, and you have to put a pin in the center of the weight you want to lift. So Stark sits down at that machine, and as Kelly forces Weathers over behind the machine, Stark says, "Stick out your tongue." But Weathers does not want to do that, and he yells, "Jesus, Stark, you don't understand. He was leaning on me real hard. I didn't have no choice." And as Kelly forces his head towards the stack of plates that Stark is now lifting, Stark says, "Oh no? Well, you got one now. Stick out your tongue or your balls." So Weathers sticks out his tongue and puts it on the plate that says 100. He's watching the plates rise above him, and the bottom one says 90. So this is supposed to be 90 pounds of plates. And Stark releases that weight, and John looks on in horror as Weathers' tongue is completely smashed. And as Weathers rolls on the ground in pain, we see Stark with a big smile on his face, and he says, "There you go." Then he turns to John and continues saying, "One problem solved. See, England? In this shit pit, those aren't your friends, are your enemies, right?" But John doesn't say anything. He just takes a moment to take it all in, and then he pulls a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, and for the first time, at least outwardly, John nervously asks, "You and me, Stark, we friends?" And Stark kind of looks at him suspiciously and says, "You know what a friend is, England? A real friend.
A friend is someone who will do something nice for you for no goddamn reason. A friend looks out for you. He ain't no shit looking out for himself.
And at that, very quickly, Stark stands up and he takes out a knife, and instead of attacking John, which they were kind of alluding to, he grabs Kelly around the throat and he stabs Officer Kelly in the chest, presumably in the heart because this blade is pretty long. And Kelly, who's a pretty strong guy, does not do anything. He falls down dead. And as Stark removes the bloody knife and drops Kelly to the ground, Stark looks at John and says,
"Now me? I don't need this blood. My rep is fuck rock solid."
And then he walks over to John and he puts the bloody knife in John's hand and he kind of makes John close his hand around it. And he says,
"Now yours is too. You're one of us. A lifer."
And then Stark puts his hands up because just at that moment, the riot police burst in and they find John holding a bloody knife, standing fairly close to Kelly. And there's even drips of blood that lead straight to John because as Stark walked it over to him, it was dripping blood. So there's like a trail leading straight to John. So it's very clear what the police are going to think as they burst into this room. And with this last splash page of the police bursting in with their nightsticks about to attack John, we get the last narration from Stark that says,
"So, you want to know what really's worse than dying? Not having any friends."
And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.